Okay, we're on. Would somebody like to lead us in prayer? Please. Would somebody like to lead us in prayer? Okay. Amen. Okay, tonight's session is going to be on Cain and Abel. And it's the passage we'll be looking at is Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. Before we get started, I just want to come back to the central affirmations that we were introduced to in the earlier sessions. I just want to keep coming back and looking at these at the beginning at every session because I think they're a good way just to keep us grounded throughout this series. So the first one is God creates creation and has a specific purpose. As I've talked about it earlier, what this really means is that creation isn't an accident. It is intentional. But that is a statement of faith for us as believers, that there is a design and there is a purpose behind creation. It is intentional. God had a purpose for creation. The second affirmation is that the relationship between God and creation develops through speaking and listening, that God intends to have with us a relationship where there is communication going on both sides, where that we are praying and we're bringing ourselves to God, but that we are also attentive to see how God speaks. And God speaks to us in many ways, sometimes through the words of friends, sometimes through the words of enemies, sometimes through nature, sometimes through just life experiences, that God is active in this world and God is continuing to speak to us in various ways. And part of our work, part of our faith work is being attentive to how God might be speaking in any given moment. 3, God's word to creation is a sovereign call, but it's a kind of call which invites obedience rather than demanding allegiance. God's relationship with us is one of invitation rather than coercion or compulsion. That God invites us to be in a relationship, that God invites us to grow closer, but God doesn't force us to. This is our free will. Free will is a major part of our relationship. And then 4, God loves creation, but creation refuses to let God be God. Free will often leads to disagreement or sometimes rebellion. Sometimes in our freedom we have a tendency to want to be God in our own life. We want to be in control. We want to tell God what to do rather than allow God to speak to us and come to that together. And 5, the relationship between God and creation is marked by tension between God's purposes and creation's resistance to God's purposes. Again, we want to be free. We want to exert our freedom. Sometimes the best way to describe humankind's relationship with God is that of a teenager. Sheila was just talking about the fact that she has a son that's going into those. Is he a teenager? He's not quite a teenager yet, but he's getting close, right? And what do teenagers want to do with you more than anything else? They want to argue. They want to resist because they want the independence. They want the freedom. And God, as a parent, divine parent to us, understands that. And allows us to have freedom, but with limits. And the limits are not arbitrary limits imposed just for God to be God, but are limits set in love so that we might grow and expand in our faith. Just as you as parents don't set limits just for the sake of setting limits, you set limits. Why? To protect your children, most of the time, right? Sometimes it's just to create peace, but mostly to protect and to guide and to teach and to lead and to nurture and to help grow. All those things. Well, that's is a good way of thinking how God reacts to us through the limits. So, looking at the passage, and I'm going to go ahead and just read it again for us, just so that we hear it again. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore a son, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out into the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You'll be a fugitive. and a wanderer on the earth. And Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So, some preliminary considerations. Have you ever had a time when you thought life was being unfair to you? I see nodding. Let's hear some examples. So, in marriage, so let's just say struggles in marriage, right? Or just relationships in period where you're going, I'm not doing anything wrong, why is this happening to me, right? Death of a spouse. Have any of you seen that advertisement for St. Jude where they have family talking about losing the girl and then her niece. So at first it's the daughter, and then it's the grandson. And the daughter gets cancer and she ends up dying. She goes to St. Jude, but she dies. And then the grandson gets, think about the same cancer, but he lives. But the family were talking about, essentially saying, this is so unfair. It's unfair. It's enough unfair that we have that one child gets cancer, but it's even more unfair that another child in the same family. So, and when there's a lot more examples of this, it can be just anything. It can be a sudden change in fortune. It can be an accident, it can be anything, and you're going, I didn't deserve this. What did I do to deserve this? This is so unfair. Second question is, how do you feel about the unfairness of life? How do you feel about the fact that life, very often, is unfair for no reason? Makes you... Right? Right. So sometimes there's a feeling of almost despair. There's a great line from the musical Fiddler on the Roof. Have you ever seen that? Great line by Tevye, who's the main character. You know, and he's a faithful Jew, you know, he says, Lord, we know that we're the chosen people, but for once, could you choose somebody else? You know, we can, after the fact, maybe make sense of it, but there's a part of us that says, I don't want to. I don't want to have to make sense of this. It's just unfair. I just want to leave it there. I just want to leave it as unfair. But the danger of doing that is then, if we just say, well, life's unfair and there's nothing that can be done about it, then that leads the sense to, well, where's God in all this then? Mm-hmm. But why does it have to be? I mean, that's the question we struggle with, is why does it have to be this hard? Even for somebody who has it worse off than me. Yeah, I can think of, even in my worst times, I can say the same thing. I can say, well, you know, I'm luckier than most. You know, this is a tough time. There's so many, but there's a part of me that says, but why should they have to do that? More than likely, they didn't deserve it. Why do you think unfairness occurs? So do you think God places those things that are unfair in our life? In our lives? As parents, do you place something in your life just to toughen up your kids? Generally, we don't do that, right? We say, what do we say to them? Well, you know, life's hard sometimes. Let's work through it. Yeah, it's going to make you stronger. Yeah, it's unfair. But it's not like we purposely put them in that situation where they're being treated unfair. Why don't we do that? Well, it's going to happen anyhow. But we also don't want our children to suffer, right? There's, there's a difference between when life is unfair, of whether to save them from it or not. That's a different question than actually putting them in an unfair situation in order so that they might learn. Life can do that all by itself. We don't need to create that. Is God ultimately responsible for the unfairness we and others encounter in life? Right. If we're being treated, for example, if we're being treated unfairly at work by our boss, it isn't like God whispered in our boss's ear and said, I need you to toughen this person up, so I want you to treat them unfairly. This situation, what? No. Well, I mean, it's the fact that we're frail human beings, right? You can, that becomes kind of that could become kinds of an intense theological question, right? Does God create the viruses and the things and the cancer in the first place? And yeah, things may aggravate it, but it wouldn't have happened if God hadn't created the cancer cell in the first place. Those are questions I have to admit are beyond me. If sin hadn't entered, that's kind of what going back to the lesson about the expulsion from the garden, right? That when sin entered into the world, then the evils that come with it also entered into the world, which also is not common to our religion. I mean, it is not exclusive to our religion, to the Christian faith. Most of your major religions in the world, most of your myths in the world, have some sort of story about how the sins and the ills of the world came into the world. Greek mythology, who caused the sins, the ills of the world to enter into the world? Pandora. There was a box that had all the ills of the world in it. And out of curiosity, she opens the box, and they all escape before she has a chance to close it back down again. Every major religion in the world has a rationale about why there's evil in the world and why bad things happen, why there is illness. Science has its own understanding of why there's illnesses in the world. The role of viruses, the role of bacteria, the role of certain mutated cells. But even science can't answer the question of ultimately of how those things originated in the first place. All they can do is, all science can really explain, is how it affects the world in which it exists, and why, and explain what this particular cell or this particular bacteria or this particular virus might do, and how it grows, and how it mutates, and the various things. We're constantly asking that question, and a part of us as people of faith have to attribute some of that to God, the origin of some of that to God. We don't like to think of a God that creates COVID, but God creates a world in which COVID can exist, has created a world in which COVID can exist. Just like the AIDS virus can exist. Just like malaria. We can learn about how it's spread, how it develops, but we are still back to the same thing when we're talking about origins. What responsibilities, if any, do we have for the unfairness of life? There are some things we have no control over, right? What we do have control over is what choices we make that may put us in a situation where life may become unfair, or the responsibility we have of creating an unfairness for someone else. We do have choices over whether or not we treat someone fairly or unfairly. Now, why am I asking all these questions about fairness and unfairness? We'll get to that a little bit later. There's 4 scenes. The passage we're looking at is broken up into 4 scenes. First scene is the birth of Cain and Abel, which is a very short scene. It's only 2 verses. The second scene is the offering. Cain and Abel both bring offerings to God. The third scene is actually only 1 verse, but it's a very powerful scene, and it's the scene of Cain killing Abel. The fourth scene is the longest of all four of the scenes, and that's what happens in terms of how God and Cain interact and how justice is done or the situation is resolved. It's the longest scene. It's the one that carries the most questions and the most, I believe, it has the most to say about human relationships with God. So, looking at the first scene, key elements of the first 2 verses. First 2 verses is the birth of Cain and Abel. And first key elements is the etymology or the meaning of the names. What does Eve say when Cain is born? Right. So God, with the help of the Lord, I have produced a man. Notice that language, right? She doesn't say, I gave birth to a child. I gave birth to a baby. She says, I brought forth a man. It's very distinct language. The actual meaning of Cain has a couple of meanings. One has been more, I guess, used in commentaries than the other. The one that's less used is created one. And it comes, and the difference between these two meanings are how the root word, which root word is being used. And in Hebrew, since it's a consonantal language, there's no vowel sounds. If you put the vowel sounds in one way, it means this way, but if you put the vowel sounds another way, it puts another way, and it's hard. One of the challenges of translating from Hebrew is getting that sense of which vowel sounds were used, because the original Hebrew, there are no vowel letters. They just knew when they read it. Well, we don't have that ability to just know, so we're trying to figure it out. So the first meaning is created one, which goes from the root source to create, to birth, to make. So this seems to fit in with what Eve says about Cain, in that with the help of the Lord, I brought forth. Almost, the word is almost like I created this son or this man. Because in this passage, she gave birth to Cain, which we have in other biblical passages with names. There is none of that in this passage, because we have to figure it out. So one understanding is to say created one. The other one is Cain means, the root word is to obtain or to acquire. So Cain then means, and the root word is really, the actual root word is actually more in terms of a lance, but it's used to conquer. The meaning, the purpose of it is to use a lance to gain or to acquire, to obtain. So the meaning of Cain then becomes, in this version, the person who acquires, who gains, who takes. This has become the more acceptable, or the more used understanding of Cain, and it comes from, and it develops from the idea of Cain taking Abel's life, of him changing the fact that he thought life was unfair by taking from another. So it's his reaction. So that has come into the meaning of Cain. I can't tell you which one I agree with most right now, but because both of them have their justification. Now, the meaning of the word Abel is much different than the word Cain. The word Abel, the root word in the meaning of Abel, means vapor or vanish. So there's a sense of what is meant by Abel is the fact that he is not going to be here for very long, and he disappears. His life is over. almost, he vanishes quickly in the story. He's there and then he's gone. He presents an offering and then he's killed. It's almost like he wasn't even there. So that brings up the question of, why is Cain given more emphasis? Even in their birth, Cain is given more emphasis. Eve says, "This, with the Lord's help, I brought forth a man." What's said about Abel? What does she say about Abel? Nothing. Just says she gave birth to him. She says nothing about him. So the question becomes, why is Cain emphasized more in this passage than Abel? He's given more lines. He's given more time. He was the firstborn. That could be a reason. But it could also be the reason that Cain is reflecting more of something that we need to deal with in the human relationship between us and God. And that meaning isn't in the murder. It's in something else. That A underneath 2, that was from last week, and I putting together the slides for, I left it, inadvertently left it in, so you can disregard that. So, we move to scene 2, the offering. And the first question we have is, both Cain and Abel are bringing forth an offering to God. And they're bringing it according to what they do. Abel raises sheep, shepherd. Cain is a tiller of the ground. He raises crops. Cain brings an offering from his flock, the fatted one. Cain brings produce from his crop. God accepts, or in the language of the Scriptures, regards Abel's offering and disregards or rejects Cain's offering. Are we given a reason why? No. This is where that question I asked at the beginning about unfairness comes in. Because what is Cain's natural reaction? What is a natural human reaction when you bring forth an offering to God along with your brother, and his is accepted and yours is not? What's going to be your immediate feeling? Why not me? It's unfair. And we're not given in the Scripture a reason why. There's been commentators that have speculated, but the Scriptures don't tell us why it's being accepted and why Cain's is being rejected. Commentators have said that Cain didn't bring forth the best of his crops. We're not told that. That could be. No, that's not what I'm saying. He felt because he thought it was unfair that his wasn't accepted. It's not that. Could be, but we're not told that, right? The strongest argument as that I've heard as far as the reason why Abel's was accepted and his wasn't was the shedding of blood. Was that Abel brought forth a living thing that sheds blood. And Cain brought forth plants. But even that seems unfair because is Cain being blamed for the vocation that he chose? Yet he could have bought a lamb from Abel and brought forth. But that may be reading back into Cain and Abel what people came to understand later. You know what I mean? That there was no Where does it say that? And then they sew figs, make loincloths, and then see. Made garments of skin. Okay, was right. But that was not a sacrifice necessarily. God was maybe I guess a more simple reading of that was that God was just making them garments that would last longer. Do you have to kill an animal to get a skin from an animal? Or can you take the skin from an animal that just naturally dies? Again, yeah, that's our making sense of it. But it's speculation. And that's what I'm saying is that it's not inconceivable that Cain could rightfully feel that he was being treated unfairly, is it?
I just can't believe that God would call something not right when sin lies at the door if he hadn't set a precedent down, set the parameters to begin with.
Could be.
What parent is going to spank their kid when they haven't even told them this is right and this is wrong?
Right.
I mean, if you do, that's not right.
Right. I'm not saying, what I'm saying is, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that God was treating Cain unfairly. What I'm saying is that it's understandable how Cain might have thought he was being treated unfairly. And that might, because note what God says to Cain when Cain is angry and his countenance falls. God says, why? Why are you angry and why is your countenance fallen? If you do, what does it say? If you do what is right or what it, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you not do well, then sin is at your door. So there is a sense that we get that Cain somehow didn't do well in God's eyes, but that Cain was angry, maybe, because he thought he did. And this is, again, the rebellion that's possible that comes from freedom of choice. Cain chose to bring what he brought, right? But he chose to believe that it was good enough and should be acceptable. But it wasn't. And so then Cain's choice after that is to be angry and to put the blame elsewhere than himself. Because anger is a choice. How many disagree with that? How many times have you felt angry and you felt you had no over control, that it wasn't a choice that you were angry, it was just a feeling that you felt? Anger is a secondary emotion. It is an emotion, it's an honest emotion, but it always is secondary. There's an emotion we feel underneath it. There's a feeling that we feel first. Maybe only for a split second, but we feel another emotion first. Fear or hurt. What does an animal do when it's wounded and cornered? It attacks. For lack of a better word, it gets angry. Right? What do we do when we feel hurt or treated unfairly or afraid of losing something? Get angry. Some of that is not our choice. That onset of heat feeling is not a choice. but choosing to stay there is. What God is saying to Cain is, first, why are you angry? I didn't accept yours. I didn't accept your offering. It wasn't good enough. Why are you angry? It just wasn't. If you do well, I'll accept it. Kind of life. But then God says, be careful, Cain, because if you stay here, sin desires you. You have to master it. You have to get in control of it. You have to not let it take control of you. Staying in that anger is a choice. Cain chose to stay in that anger. So, that's the choice that God gives Cain. Either accept the disappointment in the sense of, okay, I didn't do well enough this time, but I'm going to try again. Or choose the anger path. One will lead to a strengthening of the relationship. One will result in straying from it. Next scene. One verse. Cain invites Abel into the field, in the field. And when they're in the field, Cain rises up and kills Abel. What is meant by the word rise up? Assume he's not laying down. Overpowering. Take us out of this passage for a minute, out of this verse for a minute. When you hear those words, rise up, what do you normally think of? Could be standing up or standing up against something generally, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be bad or good. Rising up is a sense of taking control or controlling something or conquering something or battling something. What is going on with Cain is Cain, in his anger, in choosing this path, has decided the only way he can get his own back again is to take away his threat. What is his threat? Abel. Abel is his threat because Abel bested him. And the only way that he's going to get his back again is to take away that threat, is to take away Abel. It's pride working. So now, along with anger, he's choosing pride. I'm going to get my own back again. I'm going to be number one again. I'm going to be number one even if it means killing my own brother. Second question we have to ask is, Why is there no more full explanation of what went on? We have no sense of what was said before. We have no words from Abel. We have no words from Abel in the whole passage. But we have no angry words said to from Cain to Abel. No words of argument. There's no words said. All we see is Cain killing Abel. Boom, out of the blue. So the question, this is part of the way I look at Scripture, is part of when I read Scripture, I want to try to ask questions of not just what's being said, but what's not being said. And one of the things that's not being said is that there's no interchange here. And so the question is, why? Why not? Basic answer is that there's no need for words because Cain had already made the decision before they even went to the field. He was already in the state of sin before he even murdered Abel. So the murder itself, even though it's the most bloody and the most shocking to us, is actually the smallest element in the whole story. It's given the least amount of attention. Most of the attention is given to what led up to it and what follows it. So what is that passage telling us? Is that the sin itself is the smallest aspect of the relationship, because what is the most dangerous or what is the most crucial in our relationship is, one, how we're led to sin, and then what we do about it once we have sinned. That's what's crucial in our relationship. So when we move to the next scene, scene 4, with the resolution, first of all, what does Cain do when God calls out about his brother? And why does God call out? God knows what happened. Why is God asking Cain about where is Abel? See if Cain's going to be honest about it. See if Cain has any remorse about it. Right. Because what does God say when Cain says, I don't know. Am I his keeper? Am I supposed to take care of him? God says, his blood cries out to me from the soil. I know what you did, Cain. So Cain has to face up to what he does, first of all. And then he has to receive the consequences of what he did. What are the consequences? First of all, he can no longer till the soil. The soil is no longer going to be productive to him because he shed blood into it. So now that soil is going to not respond to him. So since the only thing he knew what to do was to till the soil, what is left for him? Nothing. All's left is for him to wander the earth as a fugitive. Lost. Wandering around. Nothing. No purpose. This is the consequences. Now, is God punishing Cain? Is this an act of vengeance by God on behalf of Abel? It's just the natural consequences. If you spill innocent blood on the soil, then the soil's not going to produce for you. And if you can't do what you normally do, then this life which he's going to live is the natural consequences of what he did, for what he did. It's not an act of vengeance or anger on God's part. It just is what happened. Does this end Cain's relationship with God? Why not? Right. What does Cain say to God? This is too much. Somebody will kill me. No, I'll protect you. But note that wording with the last verse, 16. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. What does that mean? And he went east of Eden. So Cain chooses to leave, fulfilling the destiny that was set before him as a consequence of what he did. Consequence of what he did was that he was going to be a wanderer, fugitive. So he's going to go away from his home. He's going to go away from his parents. He's going to go away from the very place where he first knew God, where he was in presence with God. But the fact that God put his mark on Cain as a source of protection is that even though Cain left the presence of God, God didn't leave Cain. See the difference? And what do we know about Cain? He built a city. And later on we have a story about Lamech, who also killed using a weapon made by Tubal-Cain, which means blacksmith, who was a descendant of Cain. So violence, and more likely anger, followed. Right. Could be. But he bragged about it. He took joy in it. He took pride in it. Okay, so come back to what I talked about before, the systematic theology approach to reading Genesis. Of the four, which of these fit? Ethics. What we're dealing with here is in the spectrum of ethics. Ethics is how we choose to live, how we live out our morality in our day-to-day lives. What affects that? Part of it is the decisions of what we choose to make priorities and what we choose not to make our priorities. In this case, Cain's ethics revolved around his pride and his anger. Those were the those were the emotions, those were the impetus that he chose to use in order to make his decisions in life. When something was unfair, his ethics chose to first put the blame somewhere else other than him, and then choose to to dwell in anger about it. Those are ethical decisions. Those are ethical choices. Genesis, along with the other books of the Bible, part of creating a systematic theology for oneself is saying, okay, what is going to be the grounding of the ethical choices I make? What is going to be the ground of my morality? What are going to be the grounds of the decisions I make in order to live out my life morally? What grounds my morality? For some people, what grounds their morality is power and success. That makes any decision that they do in order to maintain their power and their success becomes ethical choices for them. That becomes their ethics. For others, it is love. In this case, Cain chose to ground his ethics on his feelings of pride and anger. And it led to serious consequences for his life. Okay. Did I go way off on left field on this lesson? Are you still with me? Do you have questions or arguments? Okay. Do I have any more slides? Okay. Critical themes in the story of Cain and Abel. Unfairness of life. Life is unfair, so what do we do about it? That's an ethical question for us. How do we live with life's unfairness? How do we react? Because that's a choice. And how we react says something about where our moral grounding is and what ethical principles we have chosen to live by. What is your first reaction. What is your choice to do when you face unfairness? Try to correct it. Those different questions, aren't they? First of all, how do you deal with you yourself being treated unfairly? That's one question, and that's an ethical question. Do you strike back? Do you forgive? Do you give in? Do you avoid? All those are ethical choices.
Depending on the circumstances.
Right.
Each situation, I can think, as you were going through options, I can think of different situations where I would probably use all of them. I mean, depending on what it was and where you're at.
That's why it's called situational ethics, right? Because in one instance you might react this way, but in another instance you might react this way. How does that work? When I was leading a youth group, I asked this question. I said that it starts from, we get to ethics later, that ethics is a question we come to later, that there's something underneath it. Ethics is how we live out our lives, but underneath that is a moral code by which we see the world, right? What is right, what is wrong, right? But there's something underneath that, and that's what we value in life. Our core values, our non-negotiables in life. When we get a sense of these, then we can develop this. And out of this, then we can come to that. That it's a progression that way. So what do we value in life? Those are general things. We value loyalty, we value compassion, we value love, we value family. Right? There's only 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 core values that we have. Moral code expands that. So, the moral value is, how do we value these things? Our moral code is, how is it that we value these things? How do we value loyalty? Well, we value loyalty by practicing loyalty. How do we value compassion? We value it by treating people compassionately, try to understand it, what it means to be compassionate. How do we value family? We do it by spending time with family, communicating with family, developing that relationship, right? So we have a certain moral code. It's good to be loyal. It's good to be loving. I will try my best. My moral code is that I'm going to try my best to be loyal to my friends, to be loving and compassionate to everybody I can be, to put a priority on my family, right? That becomes our moral code. That's the way we seek to Those are the goals by which we want to govern our life. That's the code by which we want our life to be governed, right? Then the next question is, how does that play out in day-to-day life? Especially when those aspects of the code might be in opposition with one another, or seem to be. What happens when your sense of loyalty and family is in opposition to being compassionate to somebody that appears to be an enemy to them? How do you choose? How do you live out your moral code in situations that put those in context? That becomes the study of ethics. And that's where life is complicated. How does a person who loves their country but abhors violence deal with the reality of being drafted to go to war? It's a question of situational ethics. And the joy and the challenge is God gives us the freedom to determine that for ourselves. In the final theme of Cain and Abel is, how do we restore a broken relationship when that is broken as severely as Cain did through murder? How is it restored? Grace of God. The grace of God. God had every right to unequivocally and finally and completely condemn Cain for what he did. Say, you made your bed, lie in it. And if that means somebody kills you, then they kill you. You drew the first blood. It's what you get, son. But God chose grace. Okay, I've gone on way too long. Any questions? I have to say I really struggled with this lesson, because when I first came to the lesson I said, what's there to deal with? It's pretty straightforward.